that he believes that you are the culprit here is
I know who killed JonBenét. There's no doubt in my mind who killed JonBenét. These weren't the desperate words of a grieving parent. They weren't the confident declaration of a seasoned detective. They came from Linda Arndt, the only law enforcement officer trapped inside the Ramsey house on that horrible morning of December 26, 1996. And what she witnessed in those crucial hours will shatter everything you think you know about this case. You're about to discover evidence that's been buried for nearly 3 decades. Financial scandals involving millions of dollars. A coordinated cover-up that reaches the highest levels of power. And a little girl whose murder was sacrificed to protect something far more sinister than anyone imagined. If you're ready to uncover the truth that powerful people have spent millions to hide, hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to hear will change how you see this case forever. Linda Arndt arrived at 1631 15th Street that morning expecting to monitor a ransom call. What she found instead would haunt her for the rest of her career. The Ramsey house should have been electric with panic. A 6-year-old girl was missing. A ransom note demanded $118,000 and set a specific deadline for contact. Yet as Linda entered the home, an unnatural calm settled over her like fog. John and Patsy Ramsey moved through their house like strangers navigating separate tragedies. No embraces. No whispered reassurances. No shared glances of terror or hope. Linda watched with growing unease as the couple maintained an emotional distance that defied every instinct of grief she'd witnessed in her years of police work. Then came the moment that would forever cement her suspicions. The ransom note had been clear. They would contact the family between 8 and 10 a.m. As those crucial hours ticked by, Linda waited for the explosion of anxiety that should have consumed any parent when kidnappers failed to call. 10 a.m. came and went. Silence. 10:30, nothing. 11 a.m. Still no word. And in that house, filled with family and friends, not a single person mentioned the deadline. No one checked a clock. No one asked why the phone wasn't ringing. The eerie, hollow silence stretched across the house like a death shroud. But it was John Ramsey's behavior that truly disturbed her. While his 6-year-old daughter was supposedly in the hands of brutal kidnappers, Linda found him in the kitchen, sorting his mail. Not frantically searching. Not breaking down walls. Not calling every contact he had for help. He stood there, calm and focused, reading letters as if it were any other Tuesday morning. This wasn't shock. This was something else entirely. By late morning, pressure was mounting. Linda, still alone without backup, a detail so bizarre it borders on criminal negligence, asked John and Fleet White to help search the house again. Her instructions were simple. Go floor by floor. Don't touch anything. Just look. But John Ramsey ignored every word of that instruction. He didn't start with the first floor. He didn't move methodically. He went straight to the basement, without hesitation, without detours, as if he knew exactly where he was going. As if he'd been there before. As if he knew what he would find. Then came Fleet White's scream. Call an ambulance. Moments later, John emerged from that basement carrying his daughter's lifeless body. But here's what's truly chilling. He wasn't calling for help. He wasn't screaming for someone to call 911. He wasn't performing CPR or checking for signs of life. He simply carried her upstairs with an unreadable expression and laid her on the floor. Linda Arndt froze. Every alarm in her experienced mind fired at once. He had contaminated the crime scene. He had moved the body. He had destroyed crucial evidence in seconds. JonBenét was stiff, pale, long gone. But John's strange behavior continued. He walked to a chair, grabbed a throw blanket, and without asking permission from the officer present, covered his daughter's body. To an outsider, it might seem like a father's gentle final gesture. To Linda, it was devastating. Another violation of protocol, another contamination of evidence. Only after the blanket was in place did he ask if it was okay. But the moment that Linda Arndt will never forget came next. As she knelt beside JonBenét's small body, John leaned in close. His face was inches from hers. Their eyes locked in what Linda would later describe as a nonverbal exchange she would never forget. And in that moment, Linda Arndt silently slid her hand toward her gun. She counted her bullets. 18 rounds. Not because she was afraid of some unknown intruder lurking in the shadows. She reached for her weapon because she believed, fully and unquestionably, that the killer was in the room with her. And he hadn't gone anywhere. The most chilling part? Linda called for backup multiple times throughout that morning. Each time, she was told everyone was in a meeting. While she stood alone in a potential crime scene, surrounded by unpredictable witnesses and a dead child at her feet, her chain of command was unavailable. 3 hours. 9 people moving freely through the house. Not one detective arrived to relieve her. No forensic team entered. No containment was established. At 1:10 p.m., after JonBenét's body had been discovered and Linda had radioed it in, nothing changed. The house remained unsecured. Then she saw something that made her question reality itself, an ambulance driving slowly past the house without stopping. "I thought I am in the Twilight Zone," she would later say. Because in any rational world, that house would have been locked down within minutes. The body would have been photographed in place. Witnesses would have been separated. A real investigation would have begun. But in Boulder that day, none of it happened. And somewhere in that house, Linda believed, the truth had been buried alongside a little girl who would never come home. But if you think John and Patsy's strange behavior that morning was the end of their suspicious actions, you haven't heard anything yet. Because what they did in the hours after JonBenét's body was found would expose a level of legal maneuvering that innocent parents simply don't need. Within hours of JonBenét's body being discovered, John and Patsy Ramsey made a decision that would define the entire case. They didn't wait for charges. They didn't wait to be named suspects. They didn't even wait for an accusation. They lawyered up immediately. But these weren't just any lawyers. The Ramseys hired separate, high-profile criminal defense attorneys, not a family lawyer, not legal aid for a tragic situation, but full-blown crisis management specialists. The kind of legal firepower you assemble when you're expecting a war. And from that moment on, everything changed. The grieving parents who had appeared on television pleading for their daughter's safe return suddenly stopped cooperating with police. They declined formal interviews. They wouldn't sit down with detectives under normal procedures. Every question had to go through counsel. Every statement was reviewed, rewritten, and filtered through legal barriers. What had begun as a kidnapping case had now become a legal standoff. But the most revealing moment came when public pressure mounted for the Ramseys to take polygraph tests. Did they agree to the FBI's standard procedures? Did they submit to questioning by the Boulder Police Department?
No.
Instead, they arranged their own private polygraph tests, conducted on their own terms, with their own hand-picked examiner, in a controlled environment with no law enforcement oversight. April 2000, 4 years after JonBenét's murder. The Ramseys hired Edward Gelb, former president of the American Polygraph Association, a man with impressive credentials and media appearances who could lend credibility to their crumbling public image. But here's what they don't want you to know. They had tried this before. Another expert, Jerry Torriello, had administered tests with inconclusive results. Not guilty, not innocent, just noise. When those results didn't clear them, they simply did it again. John sat for 2 sessions. Patsy endured 3. The questions were straightforward. Did you kill your daughter? Do you know who did? Did you write the ransom note? According to Gelb, they passed cleanly. No deception indicated. Not a flicker, not a spike on the graph. But none of it mattered to the authorities. Not to the Boulder Police Department, not to the FBI, not to anyone who understood that truth doesn't come from machines hired by the people being questioned. The tests weren't independent. They weren't court-sanctioned. They weren't observed by detectives. They were performed in private, behind legal barricades, under the complete control of the subject's own defense team. Even the format raised red flags among experts. Multiple tests spaced closely together. The same questions phrased and rephrased. Enough repetition to dull fear, to normalize stress responses. Veteran investigators warned that such structure could compromise reliability. And there was one glaring omission that spoke louder than any polygraph result. Burke Ramsey, the only other person known to be in the house that night, never took a test. Not once. No official request, no public explanation. Years later, his lawyer would claim he was willing, but there's no record of electrodes attached, no questions asked, no graphs analyzed. Just silence. But here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. In television interviews, John Ramsey would give completely contradictory accounts of their willingness to take polygraph tests, sometimes claiming they had never been asked, other times insisting they had volunteered. On CNN, seated in a carefully arranged studio setting, John leaned forward and declared with clarity, "We were asked if we would take a lie detector test. We said certainly we would." But just weeks later, on ABC's 2020, when Barbara Walters asked the same question directly, John delivered a fundamentally different answer. "No one ever asked us to take a lie detector test." This wasn't a misquote. This wasn't selective editing. This was the same man delivering two completely contradictory versions of the same verifiable facts, each tailored to its audience. The first version, on CNN, was crafted to sell their book and repair their public image, presenting them as cooperative and transparent. The second version, on ABC, was rooted in defensiveness, framing them as persecuted victims. Which story was true? By that point, the real answer had been buried beneath layers of shifting narratives and media manipulation. To Linda Arndt, to the investigators who stood alone in that house, this wasn't forgetfulness. This was strategy. This was the calculated reshaping of facts to fit whatever frame served their needs at that moment. But if you think their contradictory statements about polygraph tests were suspicious, what happened next will show you just how far this conspiracy reached. Because John Ramsey's next move wasn't just about protecting himself and Patsy. He was about to take the only other witness to that basement discovery with him. And together, they would flee Boulder in a coordinated exodus that looked less like grief and more like damage control. The moment John Ramsey placed that call to his private pilot, just hours after carrying his daughter's lifeless body from the basement, marked more than a reaction to grief. It was the beginning of a coordinated retreat from the epicenter of the investigation. When Barbara Walters asked him about this decision years later, John's answer seemed reasonable enough. "Atlanta was our home. We lived there for 25 years. That's where our family was. We wanted to go home." But John didn't leave Boulder alone. Within days of the Ramsey family's departure, another family boarded a separate flight heading to the same destination. Fleet and Priscilla White, the very couple who had stood by the Ramseys' side since the morning of December 26th. The family that had taken Burke Ramsey into their home while the house remained an active crime scene. The couple whose presence in that house, and especially in that basement, was far more critical than anyone seemed willing to acknowledge. Fleet White wasn't just John's close friend. He was the only other person to witness firsthand what lay behind that basement door. He followed John down those stairs. He saw the tape, the bindings, the position of JonBenét's body. He was there for the discovery that would define this case forever. And within days, he was gone. Not just from the house, not just from the neighborhood, but from the entire state. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidental. This was a coordinated exit strategy. The police never stopped them. No one questioned the timing. But for those inside the investigation, it raised an unavoidable question. Why did both families need to distance themselves from Boulder so quickly? Why did the man who witnessed the crime scene with his own eyes also vanish almost in parallel with the parents? And why did their relationship begin to quietly deteriorate in the months that followed? Fleet and Priscilla White had been more than friends to the Ramseys. They were inner circle. Their children played together. They shared holidays, attended the same church, hosted dinner parties. In Boulder's tight-knit upper-class social scene, they were practically extended family. When tragedy struck on December 26th, it was the Whites who were called first. It was their home that became Burke's sanctuary, away from the chaos and police activity. It was Fleet White, not a detective, not a first responder, who accompanied John into that basement and saw what would become the most controversial crime scene in American history. But their role didn't end with that discovery. Over time, Fleet White would emerge as one of the few people close to the Ramseys willing to speak publicly and critically about the investigation. His confidence in the case collapsed. His relationship with John soured. He began writing open letters to the district attorney, challenging the integrity of the investigation, questioning law enforcement decisions, even accusing authorities of protecting certain individuals. Yet in those first crucial days after the murder, the Whites were side by side with the Ramseys. Not just as grieving friends, but as key eyewitnesses to the behavior, the decisions, and the reactions that would shape every aspect of this case. They knew what John and Patsy looked like in the hours after JonBenét's death. They knew what was said behind closed doors. They knew what wasn't said. They saw the family dynamics, the strange calm, the immediate legal maneuvering. And then they left Boulder too. What did Fleet and Priscilla White see that made staying behind too dangerous? What did they know that required them to disappear alongside the primary suspects? The answer might lie with another family entirely, one that has remained mysteriously under scrutiny despite being present at every critical moment of this case. Among all the names that have surfaced around the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, one family stands out for how little attention they've received despite their extraordinary access and involvement: Glenn and Susan Stein. On the surface, they appear to be merely family friends. But when you trace their movements before, during, and especially after the night of JonBenét's murder, a very different picture emerges. One of proximity, access, and a level of devotion that borders on the inexplicable. Here's what makes the Steins so significant. They lived exactly 84 seconds away from the Ramsey house. Closer than any other friends. Yet on the morning of December 26th, when John and Patsy were frantically calling everyone in their circle for support, the Steins weren't summoned. The Whites came. The Fernies arrived. Even their pastor was called to the house. But the family who lived closest, who knew them best, who would later sacrifice everything to protect them, they stayed away. Was this coincidence? Or was this strategic? Because what the Steins did after JonBenét's murder would reveal a level of loyalty that goes far beyond normal friendship. A devotion so complete, so consuming, that it raises the question: what exactly were they protecting? And more importantly, what did they know that made that protection necessary? But before we dive into the Steins' suspicious behavior, you need to understand something that happened just 2 days before JonBenét's murder. Something that connects Susan Stein directly to the Ramsey house and raises questions about whether this family knew more than they ever admitted. December 23, 1996. The Ramsey house was filled with guests, laughter, and Christmas cheer. John and Patsy were hosting their annual holiday party, and by all accounts, it was a successful evening. Then something happened that, in hindsight, seems almost prophetic. A 911 call was made from the Ramsey house, and abruptly hung up. When Boulder police responded to investigate, because that's what competent law enforcement does when they receive emergency calls, they found something strange. The officers weren't greeted by John or Patsy Ramsey. They weren't met by a household staff member or family relative. Instead, it was Susan Stein who answered through the intercom system. Susan Stein, who told them the call had been a mistake, made by a guest trying to dial long distance. Susan Stein, who refused to let them enter the house. Think about that for a moment. A guest at someone else's party acting as the gatekeeper when police respond to an emergency call. Denying entry to law enforcement officers, even though the call had originated from that exact location. Why was Susan Stein taking charge of the Ramsey house security? And why was she so determined to keep police away, even for what she claimed was an innocent mistake? Fast forward to December 25th, Christmas night, just hours before JonBenét would be reported missing. The Ramsey family stopped by the Stein house to drop off Christmas gifts. According to Susan's later statement, Patsy stayed and chatted for about 10 to 15 minutes. She described the family as cheerful, festive, and excited about their upcoming trip. But here's what's interesting. Susan never mentioned JonBenét appearing tired or drowsy that evening. This detail might seem minor until you contrast it with Patsy's later statement to police, where she claimed JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car and was carried directly to bed by John. Was Susan's omission innocent forgetfulness? Or was Patsy's story about JonBenét being tired of fabricated detail, added later to establish a timeline and create an alibi? When JonBenét's body was found and the Ramseys became the center of suspicion, they didn't move in with family members. They didn't check into a hotel. They moved in with the Steens. Not for a night. Not for a week. For months. Patsy would later describe this period as salvation for her sanity. But what's more revealing is what Susan Stein sacrificed to make this arrangement possible. She quit her job, a professional position at the University of Colorado, to care for Patsy full-time. She cooked, cleaned, organized, handled visitors, and managed logistics. Other witnesses described her as a Florence Nightingale figure in the household. This wasn't just compassion. This was a total personal sacrifice that makes sense only if there was far more at stake than friendship. But the most baffling decision was yet to come. In mid-1997, both families relocated to Atlanta, Georgia. John Ramsey moved first. He had family connections there and corporate ties through his business. But soon after, something unprecedented happened. Glenn Stein resigned from his position at the University of Colorado. The family sold their Boulder home. They packed up their entire life and moved to Atlanta, not near the Ramseys, but actually close enough to maintain daily contact. Their son Doug was enrolled in Holy Innocents Episcopal School. Burke Ramsey attended the Lovett School, both in Atlanta. The families vacationed together, shared holidays, and even transported each other's children across state lines. On one documented occasion, the Steens personally drove Burke from Georgia to the Ramseys' Michigan summer home. In John's own words, Burke felt completely at home with the Steens because they had lived together for so long. This level of entanglement goes far beyond normal friendship. It borders on logistical codependence. Two families essentially merging their lives, their children's educations, their social circles, their geographic locations. Yet in his initial police interview, John described the Steens as mere acquaintances. That contradiction between what he told investigators and what actually happened casts a long, disturbing shadow over the entire relationship. No public records suggest financial transactions between the families or shared legal defense costs. But Glenn and Susan both left stable, professional careers to follow a family under investigation for child murder across the country. Nobody does that without deep loyalty, serious entanglement, or shared stakes in the outcome. Were they protecting the Ramseys? Or were they protecting something bigger than all of them? As the investigation evolved and public scrutiny intensified, the Steens gradually faded into the background. But their movements, their decisions, and their unprecedented access during the most sensitive hours of this case remain undeniable. And if anyone outside the immediate Ramsey family knew more than they ever admitted, the Steens are the first place any honest investigator should look. But Susan Stein's loyalty would soon cross into territory that was not just suspicious, it was potentially criminal. Her actions in the years following JonBenét's murder would reveal a willingness to break laws, manipulate public opinion, and shield the Ramseys from scrutiny by any means necessary. What she did next would expose the depths of this conspiracy and show just how far some people were willing to go to bury the truth. Between 2000 and 2003, as the JonBenét Ramsey case continued to generate headlines and the Ramsey family faced mounting public suspicion, something unprecedented was happening behind the scenes. Someone was impersonating the Boulder police chief. Emails began appearing in the inboxes of journalists, investigators, and key figures involved in the case. These weren't obvious fakes or crude attempts at deception. They were carefully crafted messages, designed to appear as if they were coming directly from Chief Mark Beckner himself. The emails praised pro-Ramsey articles, subtly endorsed narratives that supported the family's innocence, and even implied institutional support for individuals who were publicly challenging the police investigation. Veteran reporter Charlie Brennan received one such email, complimenting his writing on the case. Former lead detective Steve Thomas got another, suggesting the department was quietly supporting his legal battles with the Ramseys. The deception was sophisticated, calculated, and remarkably effective until Charlie Brennan did what any good journalist would do. He contacted Chief Beckner directly to confirm the correspondence. Beckner had never sent those emails. Alarmed, Boulder authorities launched an investigation. They traced IP addresses, followed digital breadcrumbs, and eventually uncovered the source, an Earthlink account registered to Susan B. Stein, operating from 60 Long Grove Drive, Atlanta, Georgia. When confronted by Georgia investigators in June 2003, Susan refused to answer questions. Though the Boulder DA's office considered criminal charges, including impersonating a law enforcement official, which carries felony penalties, she faced no legal consequences. Instead, authorities issued a written warning. Susan dismissed the entire operation as a silly prank, claiming she had no intent to deceive and framing it as sarcastic humor. But humor doesn't explain the clear pattern of interference, nor the strategic timing of these emails during periods of heightened legal pressure for the Ramseys. This wasn't random mischief. This was systematic deflection, engineered messaging designed to sway public opinion under the false imprimatur of police authority. But email impersonation was just one tool in Susan Stein's arsenal. In February 1997, while the Ramseys were still residing in the Stein home, a reporter from the Globe tabloid, Ken Harrell, approached their doorstep seeking an interview. Susan cracked the door open, asked to see his press credentials, and when Harrell produced his wallet, she snatched his identification and slammed the door shut. She then called the police, claiming a suspicious individual was lurking around her property. When officers arrived, Harrell, understandably agitated after having his ID stolen, was initially treated as a potential threat until his identity was verified and the situation clarified. Susan had manufactured an entire confrontation to remove unwanted media attention from her doorstep. John Ramsey, who witnessed this incident, later shared the story with his staff at Access Graphics. Not with concern or embarrassment, but with amusement. He praised Susan's quick thinking and referred to it as a masterclass in handling the press. Among their inner circle, Susan had earned a telling nickname: Patsy's Pitbull. Not merely a protector, but an enforcer. Someone who preemptively neutralized perceived threats, whether they came from journalists, investigators, or curious members of the public. And Susan wasn't operating alone. Her husband, Glenn, also took active roles in shielding the Ramseys from scrutiny. On at least one documented occasion in 1997, he and John reportedly chased down a National Enquirer photographer on the streets of Atlanta, attempting to confiscate exposed film. These weren't isolated incidents or emotional reactions. They were calculated efforts to restrict access, control information, and shape public perception. At the core of all this activity was Susan's relationship with Patsy Ramsey, a bond that had clearly evolved far beyond normal friendship into something approaching total enmeshment. After JonBenét's death, Susan didn't just offer emotional support. She vacated her professional life, opened her home completely, and assumed full-time caregiving responsibilities for Patsy. Patsy later wrote of Susan as the mother of our household, our private nurse, our Florence Nightingale. Susan was present for family trips, medical appointments, holiday celebrations, and, perhaps most significantly, every major media appearance and legal strategy session. Rumors even circulated that she once wore a wig to impersonate Patsy and mislead photographers during a critical media moment. Though never officially confirmed, the story underscored just how far Susan might go to shield her friend from exposure. Former Detective Steve Thomas, who had worked the case extensively, once referred to Susan as the Information Minister of Ramseyland, a title that captured both her role and the almost cult-like devotion she demonstrated. She maintained vigilant presence in online forums, combating negative commentary about the family. She reportedly tried to erase or discredit any content that cast Patsy in a suspicious light. Among investigators and journalists who covered the case, Susan was viewed as a gatekeeper of the Ramsey image, perhaps even controlling the flow of information in and out of their inner circle. But here's what makes Susan Stein's behavior so significant. Innocent friends don't typically commit federal crimes to protect each other. They don't impersonate law enforcement officials. They don't steal from journalists or manufacture confrontations with media representatives. This level of interference suggests knowledge that went far beyond what any normal friend or supporter would possess. What did Susan Stein know about the night JonBenét died that made her willing to break laws to protect the Ramsey family? And given her son Doug's presence at the Ramsey house on Christmas night, is it possible that the Steins weren't just protecting John and Patsy Ramsey? Is it possible they were protecting their own child? But to understand why that theory has gained traction among investigators, you need to know about the physical evidence found in that basement. Evidence that points to children being involved in the events that led to JonBenét's death. And evidence that suggests the crime scene was staged to hide what really happened that night. But to understand why that theory has gained traction among investigators, you need to know about the physical evidence found in that basement. Evidence that points to children being involved in the events that led to JonBenét's death. And evidence that suggests the crime scene was staged to hide what really happened that night. Doug Stein was 9 years old on Christmas night 1996. He had spent the evening at the Ramsey house with his parents, celebrating with JonBenét and Burke. According to multiple witness accounts, he was one of the last children to see JonBenét alive. And then he disappeared from the official record entirely. While investigators meticulously documented every adult who had been in the Ramsey home that Christmas, Doug's presence was barely acknowledged. No formal interview. No detailed questioning about what he witnessed. No exploration of his interactions with JonBenét that final evening. For a case where investigators scrutinized every detail, from the pineapple in JonBenét's stomach to the fibers on her clothing, the oversight seems impossible to explain through incompetence alone. But here's what makes Doug's absence from the investigation even more troubling: the physical evidence found at the crime scene. In that basement room where JonBenét's body was discovered, investigators found several items that seemed completely out of place in an adult crime. A piece of nylon cord, cut with precision. A broken paintbrush handle, fashioned into a crude garrote. And most mysteriously, a Boy Scout handbook and a dictionary left open to the word incest. Detective Lou Smith, who worked the case for years, noted something crucial about these items. They suggested familiarity with the house layout, knowledge of where supplies were kept, and most significantly, they indicated someone who had time to construct the elaborate staging. The nylon cord wasn't rope you'd bring to commit a burglary. It was the type used in Boy Scout activities, cut from a longer piece that investigators never found. The paintbrush came from Patsy's art supplies, stored in a specific location that required intimate knowledge of the household. But it was the dictionary that troubled investigators most. Left open to incest, it suggested either a deliberate message or the desperate research of someone trying to understand something they had witnessed or experienced. Dr. Cyril Wecht, the renowned forensic pathologist who consulted on the case, made a chilling observation. The evidence pattern suggests this wasn't a predatory adult crime. The staging, the materials used, even the location, it all points to someone who belonged in that house. Someone who had regular access and felt comfortable moving through those spaces. Now here's where the Doug Stein theory becomes impossible to ignore. Doug was a Boy Scout. He would have been familiar with knot-tying techniques and nylon rope usage. He knew the Ramsey house layout intimately, having spent countless hours there over the years. And most crucially, he would have known exactly where Patsy kept her art supplies. Former Detective Steve Thomas, in his book about the case, mentioned an investigative theory that was quickly suppressed, that JonBenét's death might have resulted from inappropriate sexual experimentation between children that escalated beyond anyone's control. The autopsy revealed evidence of both chronic and acute sexual trauma. Dr. Wecht noted that the injury patterns were consistent with exploratory behavior by someone unfamiliar with anatomy, rather than experienced adult abuse. If this theory is correct, it would explain everything that followed. Not a planned murder, but a tragic accident during inappropriate childhood play that spiraled into panic, staging, and cover-up. It would explain why Doug was extracted from Boulder so quickly. Why the Steins coordinated their departure with the Ramseys. Why Susan Stein became so aggressively protective that she committed federal crimes to shield the family from scrutiny. They weren't just protecting their friends. They were protecting their own son from being labeled a child killer. But here's the most chilling part of this theory. If Doug Stein was involved in JonBenét's death, then the elaborate cover-up that followed involved not just the Ramseys, but an entire network of adults willing to obstruct justice to protect a 9-year-old boy. And that network had resources, connections, and motivations that went far deeper than anyone initially suspected. Because John Ramsey wasn't just a grieving father trying to protect his family. He was a businessman with secrets of his own, running operations that demanded absolute silence and complete loyalty from everyone in his orbit. Hit subscribe if you're ready to learn what John Ramsey was really doing in those months before JonBenét's death, because what we've uncovered about his business dealings will change everything you think you know about this case. 3 months before JonBenét Ramsey died, her father received a phone call that should have been routine business. Instead, it became the conversation that may have sealed his daughter's fate. John Ramsey was the president of Access Graphics, a computer distribution company that had grown from a small startup to a billion-dollar operation in less than a decade. On paper, it was a remarkable success story. In reality, it was something far more dangerous. The call came from Lockheed Martin's corporate headquarters. They wanted to discuss irregularities in Access Graphics government contracts. Specifically, they wanted to know why a computer distribution company was moving money through accounts that had nothing to do with technology. John told his secretary to schedule a meeting for after the holidays. He never made it to that meeting. Because on December 26, 1996, John Ramsey's world exploded in ways that made corporate investigations seem trivial. But here's what investigators didn't understand at the time. JonBenét's murder wasn't random violence that happened to strike a wealthy family. It was the culmination of business dealings that had put John Ramsey in debt to people who collected their payments through methods that had nothing to do with lawyers or accountants. Let me take you back to 1991, when John founded Access Graphics with financing that came from sources he never fully disclosed. The company's stated mission was simple: buy computer equipment from manufacturers and distribute it to retailers and government agencies. But former employees later described operations that seemed to have nothing to do with computers. There were cash transactions that bypassed normal accounting procedures. International wire transfers to shell companies in countries known for banking secrecy. And most mysteriously, there were frequent flights on John's private plane to destinations that had no documented business purpose. Michael Tracy, the journalist who spent years investigating the Ramsey case, uncovered flight records showing John's plane making regular trips to locations in South America, the Caribbean, and offshore banking havens. The flights were always short-term, never more than 48 hours, and the passenger manifests were either missing or heavily redacted. When Tracy asked John about these flights during a 2006 interview, John's response was telling. Sometimes business requires travel that can't be discussed publicly. There are confidentiality agreements, competitive concerns. Not everything can be transparent, but transparency wasn't the issue. The issue was that Access Graphics was generating profits that didn't match its reported revenue streams. In 1996, the year JonBenét died, Access Graphics reported revenues of $1.4 billion. But industry analysts noted that the company's profit margins were impossibly high for a distribution business. Computer distribution typically operates on thin margins, maybe 3 to 5%. Access Graphics was showing margins that approached 15 to 20% in some quarters. Where was that extra money coming from? Former Detective Steve Thomas, in his investigation of the family's finances, discovered something troubling. The Ramseys' lifestyle, the $700,000 house, the private plane, the luxury vacations, JonBenét's expensive pageant career, required an income significantly higher than John's reported salary from Access Graphics.